Thanksgiving, a day meant for gratitude, for family gathered around a table, for warmth, laughter, and the comfort of tradition. It's the one holiday that's supposed to be simple. No gifts, no pressure, just people coming together to share a meal and acknowledge what they're thankful for. But for some families, Thanksgiving became the last day they'd ever be together. For some communities, the holiday became synonymous with horror. And for some killers, the chaos of the holiday season, the travel, the distraction, the predictable routines, provided the perfect cover. 6 cases, 6 killers. Each one used Thanksgiving as camouflage, as opportunity, as the moment when no one was watching closely enough to see what was happening in plain sight. These aren't stories about the unexplained. These are solved cases, real investigations, real forensic evidence, real people who use the holiday to commit acts that still haunt the places they happened. What you're about to hear are the details that broke these cases open, the contradictions that couldn't be explained away, the behavioral patterns that revealed the truth, and the moments when investigators realized that the person responsible wasn't a stranger passing through, but someone sitting at the table. This is Plain Sight Docs, and these are the Thanksgiving massacres that shattered small-town America. The empty seat at the table, the final phone call of Martha Moxley, October 30th, 1975, the night before Halloween Day. But in Belhaven, Connecticut, the affluent neighborhoods were already preparing for the transition into the holiday season. Thanksgiving was just weeks away. The manicured lawns were beginning to show the first signs of autumn. Leaves turning gold and red, decorative wreaths appearing on front doors, pumpkins arranged on stone steps leading to homes that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Belhaven wasn't just wealthy. It was old money, an exclusive enclave within Greenwich, one of the wealthiest towns in the United States. The kind of place where driveways were gated, where property lines stretched across acres, where neighbors knew each other's names, but rarely saw each other except at carefully orchestrated social events. It was isolated by design, private, human, protected. The kind of community where people believed bad things didn't happen because they paid enough to keep the bad things out. Martha Moxley was 15 years old, blonde hair that fell past her shoulders, bright blue eyes, a smile that people remembered. She was a sophomore at Greenwich High School, popular with her classmates, involved in school activities, the kind of teenager who seemed to glide through adolescence without the darkness that sometimes shadows those years. She lived with her parents, Dorothy and David Moxley, and her older brother John in a large colonial-style home on Walsh Lane, right in the heart of Belhaven. The Moxleys had moved to Greenwich from California just a year earlier, in 1974. David Moxley worked for Touche Ross, a major accounting firm. The family had money, but they weren't Belhaven aristocracy. They were new, outsiders, in a way. They were still learning the unspoken rules of the neighborhood, still figuring out how things worked in a place where wealth wasn't just about money. It was about lineage, connections, and knowing which families mattered. But Martha had adjusted quickly. She'd made friends. She was outgoing, social, confident. And one of the families she'd become close with lived directly across the street, the Skakels. The Skakel family was everything Belhaven represented. Wealth that stretched back generations. Connections to some of the most powerful families in America. Specifically the Kennedys, through the marriage of Ethel Skakel to Robert F. Kennedy. Rushton Skakel, a patriarch, was rarely home. He traveled frequently for business, leaving the house to his 7 children, most of them teenage boys, and very little adult supervision. The Skakel house was known in the neighborhood as chaotic. Loud. Teenagers coming and going at all hours. Parties. Drinking. The kind of environment that parents in Belhaven whispered about, but didn't confront directly, because the Skakels were connected, and confrontation had consequences. Martha had spent time at the Skakel house. She was friendly with Tommy Skakel, the oldest son still living at home. He was 17, good-looking, charming, in the way that boys from wealthy families often are, confident, entitled, used to getting what they wanted. There were rumors that Tommy and Martha had been involved romantically, though the nature of their relationship was never entirely clear. They'd spent time together. They'd been seen talking, laughing, sitting close. Whether it was serious or just teenage flirtation, no one could say for certain. On the night of October 30th, 1975, Mischief Night, the traditional evening before Halloween when teenagers roamed suburban neighborhoods, pulling harmless pranks, Martha went out with friends. It was a group of kids from Belhaven, including Tommy Skakel and his younger brother, Michael. They moved between houses, egging cars, throwing toilet paper in trees, the kind of low-stakes rebellion that defined adolescence in affluent suburbs. Martha was last seen alive around 9:30 p.m. She'd been near the Skakel house, talking to Tommy. Witnesses, other teenagers who were part of the group, said she seemed normal, happy, calm. There was no indication that anything was wrong. She told friends she was heading home. Her house was less than 200 yards away, directly across the street. It should have taken her 2 minutes to walk there, but she never made it. The next morning, October 31st, Halloween, Martha's mother, Dorothy, woke up and realized her daughter wasn't in her bed. She checked the house. She called friends. No one had seen Martha since the night before. By mid-morning, Dorothy was frantic. She called the Greenwich police. At 12:30 p.m., Martha's body was found. A neighbor's child, playing in the yard, had discovered her beneath a tree on the Moxley property, just a short distance from the house. She was lying face down. Her jeans and underwear had been pulled down. She'd been beaten to death, brutally. The injuries were severe: multiple skull fractures, facial trauma, wounds that indicated a sustained violent attack. The investigation moved quickly. Emily's phone records were pulled. Her last outgoing text, sent at 9:45 p.m., pinged off the cell tower covering the downtown plaza. After that, nothing. The phone went dark. But here's the critical detail. Emily's phone was later found in her bedroom, still plugged into the charger on her desk. She had left it behind before the carol service. That single fact eliminated the most common theories in missing person cases. Emily had not used her phone to coordinate a secret meeting. She had not texted a boyfriend, an estranged friend, or anyone suggesting plans to leave. She had not been lured by an online predator. Her phone wasn't even with her. Michael Skakel, Tommy's younger brother, was also interviewed. He was 15 at the time, the same age as Martha. He told investigators he'd been out with friends that evening, driving around, drinking. He said he'd come home late, gone to his room, and didn't see or hear anything unusual. He seemed nervous during the interview, but so did everyone. It was a traumatic situation. The entire neighborhood was in shock. The investigation stalled almost immediately. Part of the problem was forensic. In 1975, DNA testing didn't exist. The physical evidence, blood, fibers, the murder weapon, was collected and analyzed using the techniques available at the time, but those techniques were limited. There were no definitive matches, no smoking gun. The other problem was social. Belhaven was a community that protected its own. Neighbors were reluctant to talk. Families closed ranks. The Skakel family hired high-powered attorneys almost immediately, and those attorneys made it clear that their clients would not be subjected to undue harassment. The investigation, which should have moved quickly and aggressively, instead became cautious, tentative, slow. Months passed, then years. The case went cold. For the Moxley family, the lack of resolution was agony. Dorothy Moxley became an advocate, pushing for the case to remain open, demanding answers, refusing to let her daughter's death be forgotten. She gave interviews. She wrote letters. She kept Martha's name in the public eye. But nothing changed. The case remained unsolved. But then, in the 1990s, something shifted. A writer named Dominic Dunn, who specialized in covering high-profile crimes involving wealthy families, became interested in the Moxley case. He started investigating. He interviewed people who'd been teenagers in Belhaven in 1975. He dug into the backgrounds of everyone involved. And he started hearing things, rumors, whispers, stories that hadn't been told to police 2 decades earlier. One name kept coming up: Michael Skakel. Michael had struggled after Martha's death. He developed serious substance abuse problems, alcohol, drugs. His behavior had become erratic, violent. His family had sent him to a series of private schools and rehabilitation programs, trying to get him under control. And at one of those programs, a facility called Ellen School in Maine, Michael had apparently made statements, confessions, admissions about being involved in Martha's death. Former classmates and counselors began coming forward. They told investigators that Michael had talked about the murder during group therapy sessions, that he'd described being drunk that night, that he'd said he might have done something terrible but couldn't remember the details, that he'd expressed guilt and fear about what he was capable of. In 1998, the case was officially reopened. A special grand jury was convened to review all the evidence, old and new. Investigators began re-interviewing witnesses, some of whom were now willing to talk in ways they hadn't been in 1975. The social pressure that had kept people silent was beginning to lift. Forensic experts re-examined the physical evidence, the golf club, the injuries, the timeline, and they began constructing a new theory of the crime. The attack on Martha Moxley hadn't been planned. It had been impulsive, driven by emotion, rage, jealousy, alcohol. The level of violence suggested someone who knew her, someone who felt rejected or humiliated, someone who lost control. Michael Skakel fit that profile. Investigators learned that Michael had been infatuated with Martha, that he'd watched his older brother, Tommy, spend time with her and had been jealous. That, on the night of October 30th, after Tommy had gone inside, Michael had approached Martha. What happened next was unclear, whether he'd tried to talk to her, tried to touch her, tried to kiss her, but something had gone wrong. Martha had rejected him, pushed him away, and Michael, drunk and volatile, had snapped. The golf club had been nearby, part of the set the Skakel boys used casually, left outside or in the garage. Michael had grabbed it, and he'd attacked. The violence was extreme, sustained. He'd hit her multiple times, even after she was down, even after she was unconscious. He'd driven the shaft of the broken club through her neck, and then he'd left her there, under the tree, and walked back across the street to his house. In January 2000, Michael Skakel was arrested. He was 40 years old. It had been 25 years since Martha's death. He was charged with murder. The trial took place in 2002. It was a media sensation. The Skakel name, the Kennedy connection, the decades of unresolved grief. Cameras lined the courthouse steps. Reporters filled the courtroom. The prosecution presented the statements Michael had made at Ellen School. They presented testimony from people who'd heard him talk about the murder. They presented forensic analysis of the crime scene, the weapon, the injuries. They argued that Michael Skakel had killed Martha Moxley in a fit of drunken rage after she rejected him, and that his family's wealth and influence had protected him for decades. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that Michael's statements in therapy were taken out of context, that he'd been confused, traumatized, pressured into saying things that weren't true. They pointed to Tommy Skakel, arguing that he'd been the last person to see Martha alive, that his story had inconsistencies, that the investigation had focused on the wrong brother. But the jury sided with the prosecution. On June 7th, 2002, Michael Skakel was convicted of murder. He was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. For the Moxley family, the verdict was a form of closure. After 27 years of waiting, of fighting, of living with the unresolved horror of Martha's death, they finally had an answer. The person who killed Martha wasn't a stranger who'd wandered into Belhaven. It was someone she knew, someone who lived across the street, someone whose family had protected him, consciously or not, for decades. But the legal battle wasn't over. In 2013, Michael Skakel's conviction was overturned. A judge ruled that his trial attorney had been ineffective, that the defense hadn't been adequate. A new trial was ordered. In 2016, the Connecticut Supreme Court upheld the decision to overturn the conviction. Michael Skakel was released on bail. But then, in 2018, The Connecticut Supreme Court reversed itself. The conviction was reinstated. The court ruled that the original defense had been sufficient and that the evidence supported the guilty verdict. And then, in 2020, prosecutors made a final decision. They announced they would not retry Michael Skakel. The case was closed. Michael Skakel was released, but the conviction remained on the books. Legally, Michael Skakel is the person who murdered Martha Moxley. The resolution is messy. Michael Skakel maintains his innocence. His legal team continues to argue that he was wrongly convicted. But the evidence, forensic, behavioral, testimonial, points clearly in one direction. Martha Moxley was killed by someone she knew. Someone who lived across the street. Someone who felt entitled to her attention and who responded to rejection with lethal violence. And that person was protected, for decades, by wealth, by connections, by a community that didn't want to believe one of its own could be capable of such an act. This case remains one of the most baffling examples of how privilege can delay justice. The investigation should have been aggressive from the start. The evidence pointed to the Skakel family almost immediately. But the social dynamics of Belhaven, the reluctance to accuse, the power of wealth, the influence of family name, created a barrier that took 25 years to break through. Dorothy Moxley fought for her daughter every single day of those 25 years. She refused to let the case die. She refused to let Martha be forgotten. And because of her determination, the truth eventually came out. But the cost was immeasurable. Every Thanksgiving, for 27 years, the Moxley family sat at a table with an empty seat. A reminder of the girl who was murdered steps from her own front door. A reminder that even in the wealthiest, most protected neighborhoods, violence can reach in and destroy. And a reminder that justice, when it's delayed, is never quite the same as justice delivered swiftly. Martha Moxley was 15 years old. She should have walked home that night. She should have had a future. Instead, she became a symbol of everything that's wrong, with a system that protects the powerful and forgets the victims. Belhaven is still there. The houses are still beautiful. The lawns are still manicured. But the community knows what happened. They know that one of their own committed murder. And they know that for decades, they looked the other way. The Turkey Trot Trap, conflicting evidence in Wichita Falls. Thanksgiving morning, 1980, Wichita Falls, Texas, a city in the northern part of the state, about 2 hours northwest of Dallas, right along the Oklahoma border. Population around 100,000 at the time. It was a city that straddled identities. Not quite small-town rural Texas, but not yet a major metropolitan area either. It had oil refineries, manufacturing plants, Shepherd Air Force Base just outside the city limits. It was a place where people worked hard, where families had deep roots, where Thanksgiving was taken seriously as a day of tradition and community. One of the city's most beloved Thanksgiving traditions was the Turkey Trot, a 5K run held every year on Thanksgiving morning. It had started in the early 1970s as a small community event and had grown into something larger. By 1980, hundreds of people participated. Families, high school athletes, local business owners, military personnel from the base. It was a feel-good event, a way to work up an appetite before the big meal, a celebration of health, community, and gratitude. The race started at 8 a.m. sharp. Participants gathered near the high school, registered, pinned race bibs to their shirts, and lined up. The route was straightforward, a loop through residential neighborhoods, along tree-lined streets, past churches and parks, finishing back at the school. It was safe, predictable, the kind of event where parents let their teenagers go alone, knowing nothing bad could happen. But in 1980, something did. Jennifer Hayes was 17 years old, a senior at Ryder High School. She was a runner, cross-country team in the fall, track team in the spring. She was fast, competitive. She'd placed in the top 5 at regional meets. She was being recruited by a few smaller colleges, schools that offered partial scholarships for athletes. Running was her identity. It was what she loved. It was her future. Jennifer lived with her parents, Robert and Susan Hayes, in a modest house on the west side of town, about a mile from Ryder High School where the turkey trot started. The plan that Thanksgiving morning was simple. Jennifer would walk to the race start, meet up with some friends from the team, run the 5K, and then head back home for Thanksgiving dinner with her family. It was a routine she'd done a dozen times for other races. There was no reason to think this time would be any different. Jennifer left her house around 7 a.m. She was wearing her running gear, blue shorts, a white t-shirt with the Ryder High Track logo, running shoes. She had her race bib in her hand, ready to pin on when she got to the starting line. She told her parents she'd be back by 9:30 a.m. She kissed her mother on the cheek. She walked out the front door. That was the last time her parents saw her alive. By 9 a.m., Jennifer hadn't arrived at the race start. Her friends, waiting for her near the registration table, started calling her house. No answer. They figured maybe she'd overslept, or changed her mind, or decided to run the race on her own. It wasn't like her, but it was Thanksgiving. Maybe family plans had changed. By 10 a.m., when Jennifer still hadn't shown up and wasn't answering the phone at home, her friends started to worry. One of them drove to the Hayes house and knocked on the door. Jennifer's mother answered. She said Jennifer had left hours ago. She should have been at the race. That's when the panic started. Jennifer's father, Robert, got in his car and drove the route Jennifer would have taken, down Kemp Boulevard, the main road that connected their neighborhood to the high school. He drove slowly, looking for any sign of her. He checked the parks, the side streets. He asked people if they'd seen a girl in running clothes. No one had. By noon, the Hayes family called the Wichita Falls Police Department. A missing persons report was filed. Officers began searching the area. Volunteers from the turkey trot, many still in their race gear, joined the search. They spread out across the city, checking alleys, vacant lots, construction sites. They called Jennifer's name. They knocked on doors. They searched for hours, but they found nothing. The search continued through Thanksgiving night. Floodlights were set up. Search dogs were brought in. The local news ran a story showing Jennifer's photo, asking anyone with information to come forward. The city, which had started the day in a festive mood, ended it in fear. On November 28th, the day after Thanksgiving, Jennifer's body was found. A utility worker, checking power lines in a remote area on the outskirts of town, noticed something in a field about 3 miles from where Jennifer was last seen. The field was isolated, nothing but scrub brush and dirt, bordered by a 2-lane highway that saw minimal traffic. It wasn't a place people went. It wasn't a place Jennifer would have had any reason to be. Her body was lying face down in the dirt. She was still wearing her running clothes, but she'd been strangled. The medical examiner estimated the time of death at some time on Thanksgiving morning, between 7:30 a.m. and 9 a.m., right around the time she would have been walking to the race. But then investigators noticed something that didn't make sense. There were no signs of a struggle at the scene. The ground around Jennifer's body was undisturbed. No scuff marks, no torn clothing, no broken vegetation. If Jennifer had been attacked in that field, if she'd fought back or tried to run, there should have been evidence, but there was nothing. The forensic team concluded that Jennifer hadn't been killed in the field. She'd been killed somewhere else and then transported there. Her body had been placed carefully, deliberately, in a location designed to be out of the way, hidden. But where had she been killed? And how had her body been moved? Detectives began reconstructing Jennifer's route. She would have walked south on Kemp Boulevard toward the high school. Kemp was a busy road during the day, but early on Thanksgiving morning, it would have been quiet. Most people were still home, getting ready for the holiday. There would have been minimal traffic, minimal witnesses. At this point, you're likely asking, how does someone abduct a 17-year-old girl in broad daylight on a major road without anyone seeing it? That was the question that haunted investigators. The initial theory was that a vehicle had stopped. Someone had forced Jennifer inside. It was the only explanation that made sense. But who? And why? The first suspect was a transient. A man had been seen near the highway on November 26th, the day before Thanksgiving, hitchhiking and asking for money at a gas station. He was described as unkempt, probably in his 30s, wearing a dirty jacket. He fit the profile of someone who might commit an opportunistic crime, see a vulnerable target, act impulsively, flee the area. Detectives put out a bulletin. They checked with other law enforcement agencies in the region, but the man was never identified. He seemed to have vanished. And the more investigators looked at the evidence, the less the transient theory made sense. The crime wasn't opportunistic. It was organized, deliberate. The lack of a struggle suggested Jennifer had been subdued quickly, probably by someone she didn't perceive as a threat. The transportation of her body to a remote location indicated planning, knowledge of the area, the ability to move freely without attracting attention. This wasn't a drifter passing through. This was someone local, someone who knew Wichita Falls, someone who knew Jennifer's routine, someone who knew she'd be walking to the turkey trot that morning. Detectives began looking at people in Jennifer's life: friends, classmates, teachers, coaches, anyone who would have known she'd be on Kemp Boulevard that morning. One name stood out: Mark Jensen. Mark Jensen was 34 years old. He was the head track coach at Ryder High School. He'd been coaching there for 6 years. He was well known in the community, respected, admired, the kind of coach who produced winning teams and got kids into college. He was married. He had 2 young children. He attended First Baptist Church every Sunday. He was, by all appearances, a model citizen. And he'd coached Jennifer Hayes. Jennifer was one of his top athletes. He'd worked with her closely: training plans, race strategy, college recruitment. He knew her schedule. He knew her routines. He knew she was planning to run the turkey trot that morning because the team had discussed it during practice the week before. And Mark Jensen had participated in the turkey trot. Detectives obtained the race registration list. Jensen's name was on it. He'd run the race. He'd finished with a time of 34 minutes, placing him somewhere in the middle of the pack. His wife confirmed he'd left the house around 7:30 a.m. to get to the race start and had returned home around 9:15 a.m. On the surface, his alibi seemed solid. He'd been at a public event with hundreds of witnesses. How could he have been involved? But investigators started looking closer at the timeline. The race started at 8 a.m. Jensen's finish time was recorded at 8:34 a.m. That gave him 34 minutes on the course. But the route was only 5 kilometers, a little over 3 miles. For an experienced runner, which Jensen was, that was a leisurely pace. Easily achievable. But it also meant there were gaps. Moments when he could have deviated from the route without anyone noticing. Moments when he could have been somewhere else. Detectives drove the route Jennifer would have taken from her house to the race start. There was a section of Kemp Boulevard, about a quarter mile, that was relatively isolated. Few houses, minimal traffic, lined with trees and set back from the road. If someone had been waiting there in a vehicle, it would have been easy to stop and approach Jennifer without being seen. Mark Jensen drove a white Dodge van. He used it to transport equipment for the track team: hurdles, starting blocks, cones. It was a familiar sight around the school. Students had been in that van dozens of times. If Jensen had pulled up next to Jennifer on Kemp Boulevard and offered her a ride, she wouldn't have thought twice. He was her coach. She trusted him. Detectives obtained a warrant to search the van. Inside, forensic technicians found fibers. Synthetic fibers that matched the fabric of Jennifer's running shirt. They also found a small blood stain on the floor of the cargo area, partially hidden under a rubber mat. In 1980, DNA testing wasn't available, but blood typing was. The blood was type A positive. Jennifer's blood type was a positive. Confronted with this evidence, Mark Jensen's calm demeanor began to crack. He admitted that he'd seen Jennifer that morning. He said she'd been walking along Kemp Boulevard, and he'd stopped to offer her a ride. He said it was innocent. He was heading to the race start anyway, and it made sense to give her a lift. He said she'd accepted. But then his story started to change. He said they'd gotten into an argument in the van. He said Jennifer had accused him of being too controlling during practice. He said she'd become upset and tried to get out of the van while it was still moving. He said he'd grabbed her arm to stop her, and things had escalated. Detectives didn't believe him. The forensic evidence told a different story. Jennifer hadn't been killed in the van. The minimal blood evidence suggested she'd been killed elsewhere, and the ligature marks on her neck indicated she'd been strangled with sustained pressure, not a sudden, reactive act, but something deliberate, controlled. A second search of Mark Jensen's property led to a critical discovery. In the garage behind his house, detectives found a storage shed. Inside were tools, sports equipment, and a rolled-up blue tarp. The tarp had blood stains. Forensic analysis confirmed the blood was type A positive, human dye, consistent with Jennifer Hayes. Under renewed interrogation, with the physical evidence mounting against him, Mark Jensen confessed. He described a plan that had been forming for weeks. He'd been obsessed with Jennifer. He'd watched her during practice, paid attention to the way she moved, the way she talked, the way she interacted with other students. He said he'd convinced himself that she was special, that there was a connection between them that went beyond coach and athlete. On Thanksgiving morning, he'd left his house early. He told his wife he wanted to warm up before the race. He drove his van to the isolated section of Kemp Boulevard and waited. When Jennifer walked past, he pulled up next to her and offered her a ride. She accepted without hesitation. Why wouldn't she? He was her coach. He drove her to an empty lot near the highway, a place he'd scouted in advance. He said he'd tried to talk to her, tried to explain his feelings, but Jennifer had been confused, uncomfortable. She tried to leave, and Jensen had panicked. He strangled her in the back of the van. He said it took several minutes. He said she'd fought at first, but then stopped. He wrapped her body in the tarp and drove to the field where she was eventually found. He placed her there, in the dirt, and drove away. Then he went to the race. He pinned on his race bib. He ran 5K with hundreds of other people. He finished. He went home. He had Thanksgiving dinner with his wife and children. Mark Jensen was arrested on December 15, 1980. He was charged with first-degree murder. At trial, the prosecution presented the forensic evidence: the fibers, the blood, the tarp, data. They presented his confession. They presented testimony from forensic psychologists who described Jensen's behavior as predatory, calculated, and narcissistic. The defense tried to argue that the confession had been coerced, that Jensen had been under duress, that the physical evidence was circumstantial. But the jury didn't agree. On August 3, 1981, Mark Jensen was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He's currently incarcerated at the Telford Unit in Texarkana, Texas. He's now in his late 70s. He's never expressed genuine remorse. In interviews over the years, he's described the crime in detached clinical terms, as if discussing an abstract problem rather than the murder of a 17-year-old girl. The people of Wichita Falls were devastated. Mark Jensen wasn't a stranger. He was a coach, a husband, a father, a respected member of the community. Parents had trusted him with their children. Jennifer Hayes had trusted him. The turkey trot continued in subsequent years, but the 1980 race is never forgotten. The Hayes family established a scholarship in Jennifer's name, awarded annually to a female athlete at Ryder High School, who demonstrates both athletic excellence and personal character. Every Thanksgiving, before the race begins, there's a moment of silence. Runners bow their heads, and for just a moment, the city remembers the girl who never made it to the starting line. This case remains one of the most disturbing examples of how killers exploit community events. Mark Jensen didn't avoid the holiday. He didn't hide. He integrated himself into the celebration. He used the chaos, the distraction, the trust that people have during moments of community joy to commit an act of unspeakable violence. And for hours, while hundreds of people ran a race meant to celebrate gratitude and togetherness, Jennifer Hayes lay dead in a field, killed by the man who was supposed to protect her, guide her, help her achieve her dreams. The empty seat at the Hayes family table at Thanksgiving wasn't just a loss. It was a betrayal, a reminder that the people we trust with our children, coaches, teachers, mentors, are sometimes the ones we should fear the most. The Missing Hunter, The Frozen Silence of Upper Peninsula. Thanksgiving weekend, 2005. Michigan's Upper Peninsula. A vast, unforgiving wilderness that stretches across the northern reaches of the state, bordered by Lake Superior to the north and Lake Michigan to the south. This isn't the Michigan that most people picture when they think of the Great Lakes state. No cities, no suburbs, no convenience stores on every corner. This is isolation in its purest, most uncompromising form. Dense forests of pine and hardwood that stretch for hundreds of square miles without interruption. Frozen swamps where the ground never fully thaws, even in summer. Rocky outcroppings covered in moss and lichen, remnants of glacial activity from 10,000 years ago. In late November, when deer hunting season reaches its peak, the landscape becomes even more brutal. Temperatures drop well below freezing, sometimes reaching 10 or 20 degrees below zero at night. Snow accumulates in feet, not inches, building drifts that can bury vehicles and obscure trails within hours. Daylight shrinks to less than 9 hours, leaving long stretches of darkness that swallow the forest whole. The wind off Lake Superior is relentless, cutting through layers of clothing like a blade. And the nearest town, the nearest phone, the nearest hospital, these can be 30, 40, sometimes 50 miles away, accessible only by logging roads that aren't maintained during winter months. This is where people come to hunt. White-tailed deer. Black bear. The Upper Peninsula has some of the best hunting in the Midwest, and Thanksgiving weekend is considered prime time. Hunters from across Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, and even farther south make the annual pilgrimage north, packing their trucks with gear, setting up camps in remote clearings, and spending days tracking game through terrain that tests even the most experienced outdoorsmen. But the wilderness doesn't care about experience. It doesn't care about preparation. It doesn't care if you've been hunting these woods for 20 years, or if this is your first trip. And it certainly doesn't care about the holiday. Between November 24th and November 27th, 2005, Thanksgiving weekend, 3 hunters vanished in the forest near Marquette, a small city on the southern shore of Lake Superior. 3 separate disappearances. 3 men who had no apparent connection to each other. 3 cases that initially seemed like tragic accidents. Men getting lost in the wilderness, succumbing to the cold, falling victim to the unforgiving environment. But these weren't accidents. And what investigators eventually discovered would reveal one of the most disturbing patterns in Michigan criminal history. The first disappearance occurred on November 24th, Thanksgiving Day itself. David Brennan was 42 years old. He lived in Lansing, Michigan's state capital, about 4 hours south of the Upper Peninsula. He was married, had 2 teenage daughters, worked as an accountant for a regional firm. He was an experienced hunter. He'd been coming up to the UP for over 20 years, usually solo, setting up a small camp in the forest and spending a week tracking deer through the frozen wilderness. His wife, Karen, was used to the routine. David would leave the day before Thanksgiving, drive north with his truck packed full of gear, set up his camp in a location he'd scouted during previous trips, and come back the following weekend with stories and, if he was lucky, a deer to be processed. On November 23rd, David left Lansing as planned. He'd kissed Karen goodbye, hugged his daughters, promised he'd be careful. He'd made this trip dozens of times. There was no reason to worry. David called Karen that evening from a gas station in Escanaba, a small city about halfway to his destination. He said the weather was cold but clear. He said the roads were in decent shape. He said he'd be out of cell phone range for the next few days. There was no service in the remote areas where he hunted, but he'd check in when he got back to civilization. Karen told him to be safe. He said he always was. That he knew these woods. That he'd be fine. That was the last time anyone heard from him. David was supposed to return home on November 30th. When he didn't show up that evening, Karen wasn't immediately worried. Sometimes hunters stayed an extra day if the weather was good or if they were close to getting a deer. But when David didn't call by the afternoon of December 1st and still wasn't home by evening, Karen started to panic. She tried calling his cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. She called again and again. Nothing. On the morning of December 2nd, Karen contacted the Michigan State Police. She gave them all the information she had. David's planned route, the general area where he usually set up camp, a description of his truck and gear. The state police dispatcher took down the details and promised to send a patrol to check the area. On December 2nd, 2 state police troopers drove out to the location Karen had described, a remote area about 15 miles west of Marquette, accessible only by a series of rough logging roads that weren't maintained in winter. The roads were covered in snow, difficult to navigate even in a 4-wheel drive vehicle. After nearly 2 hours of slow, careful driving, they found David's truck. It was parked at the end of a logging road, covered in a thick layer of snow. The doors were locked. The windows were iced over. The troopers cleared the snow and looked inside. David's camping gear was there: tent, sleeping bag, camp stove, food supplies. Everything he'd need for a week in the wilderness. But no David. They searched the immediate area on foot. They found tracks leading away from the truck, heading into the forest. But the tracks were old, filled with snow, difficult to follow. They called for backup. Search and rescue teams were deployed. Volunteers from local communities, experienced woodsmen who knew the terrain, arrived with snowmobiles and tracking dogs. They searched the area around David's truck, following the trails, checking nearby clearings, looking for any sign of where he might have gone. But the weather had been harsh. Heavy snowfall on November 25th and 26th had dumped over 2 feet of fresh snow on the region. Any tracks or scent trails that might have led searchers to David had been obliterated. The dogs couldn't pick up a trail. The volunteers searched for 3 days, covering miles of forest, checking every possible location where a lost hunter might have taken shelter. Nothing. No sign of David. No body. No gear. No indication of where he'd gone or what had happened to him. After 3 days of intensive searching, with no results and worsening weather conditions, the search operation was scaled back. The official assumption was that David had gotten lost, disoriented in the featureless forest, and had succumbed to hypothermia. His body, searchers believed, would be found when the snow melted in spring. It was a tragic accident, but not uncommon in the Upper Peninsula. Every year, hunters got lost. Some made it out. Some didn't. The case was filed as a missing person, presumed dead due to exposure. But then, the second disappearance happened. November 25th, the day after Thanksgiving. Scott Ramirez was 36 years old. He lived in Green Bay, Wisconsin, just across the state line from Michigan's Upper Peninsula. He was part of a hunting group. 4 close friends who'd been making an annual trip to the UP for the past 8 years. They'd rented a cabin about 20 miles north of Marquette, near a small, isolated community called Big Bay. The cabin was rustic. No electricity or running water, just a wood stove for heat and bunks for sleeping. But that was exactly what they wanted. Complete disconnection from the modern world. A chance to experience the wilderness the way their grandfathers had. On the morning of November 25th, Scott left the cabin alone. He told his friends he was going to scout a ridge about 2 miles east of the cabin, a place where they'd seen fresh deer tracks the previous day. He said he'd be back by noon. He wasn't planning to hunt, just scout, check for signs, maybe set up a blind for the next day. He took his rifle, his pack with water and snacks, a handheld GPS unit, and a walkie-talkie. He was experienced, careful. He'd grown up hunting in northern Wisconsin. He knew the risks of the wilderness. He knew how to navigate. He knew how to stay safe. By 2 p.m., when Scott hadn't returned and wasn't responding to radio calls, his friends started to worry. They hiked out to the ridge he'd mentioned, following the most logical route. They called his name. They fired 3 shots into the air, the universal distress signal, hoping he'd hear and respond. Nothing. Nothing. By 5 p.m., as daylight began to fade, they knew something was wrong. They hiked back to the cabin, got in their truck, and drove to the nearest town. Big Bay, population less than 300. They found the small township office and called for help. Bete. Michigan State Police and local volunteer search and rescue teams responded. They organized a search party and headed out to the ridge Scott had planned to scout. They searched through the night, using flashlights and portable generators to power floodlights. They found Scott's tracks leading east from the cabin, clear boot prints in the snow. But about a mile out from the cabin, the tracks disappeared. Not gradually, not faded by wind or covered by fresh snow. They just stopped, as if Scott had vanished mid-step. The search teams expanded the perimeter. They searched in widening circles from the point where the tracks ended. They used dogs. They used thermal imaging equipment borrowed from the Air Force Base in Marquette. They searched for 2 full days, covering over 10 square miles of dense forest. No sign of Scott. No body. No equipment. No explanation. At this point, you're likely asking, how does someone just disappear in the middle of a trail? That was the question that haunted investigators. And it was a question that would soon have a terrifying answer. The case was filed as a missing person. The assumption, once again, was that Scott had somehow gotten disoriented, wandered off the trail, and succumbed to the elements. But his friends didn't believe it. Scott was too experienced, too careful. He had a GPS. He had a radio. He should have been able to find his way back, or at least call for help. But he was gone. And then, just 2 days later, the third disappearance occurred. November 27th, the Sunday after Thanksgiving. Thomas Ellison was 51 years old. He lived in Marquette itself, one of the few true cities in the Upper Peninsula. He was a lifelong resident of the UP, born and raised in the forests, a man who knew the wilderness better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. He'd been hunting these woods since he was a teenager, over 35 years of experience. He knew the trails. He knew the terrain. He knew the dangers. He was cautious, methodical, deliberate, not the kind of person who made mistakes. On the morning of November 27th, Thomas told his wife he was heading out to one of his favorite hunting spots, a clearing near the Yellow Dog River, about 12 miles southwest of Marquette. He'd been going to that spot for years. He knew exactly how to get there. He knew the area like the back of his hand. He told his wife he'd be back before dark. He took his rifle, his pack, his cell phone, though he knew there was no service in that area, and his truck. When Thomas didn't return by 8 p.m., his wife called the police. Given the 2 recent disappearances, authorities were on high alert. Search teams were dispatched immediately. Investigators began interviewing locals, longtime residents of Marquette, Big Bay, and the surrounding communities. Hunters who'd been in the area that weekend. People who lived in the wilderness year-round. They asked if anyone had seen anything unusual. Any strangers. Any vehicles that didn't belong. Any behavior that seemed off. Most people had nothing to offer. But one name kept coming up. Not as a suspect initially, but as a point of reference. A warning. A cautionary tale that locals told each other but rarely shared with outsiders. Daniel Stroud. Daniel Dan Stroud was 63 years old. He'd lived in the Upper Peninsula for over 40 years, since the late 1960s. He wasn't from Michigan originally. Most people believed he'd come from somewhere out west, maybe Montana or Wyoming, though no one knew for sure. He'd arrived with no family, no friends, no explanation. He'd bought a small parcel of land deep in the forest, miles from any road, and built a cabin with his own hands. He'd lived there ever since, completely off the grid. No electricity, no phone, no running water, no connection to the outside world. He hunted for meat. He trapped fur-bearing animals and traded the pelts for supplies. He lived entirely off the land, in a way that most modern people couldn't even imagine. Most locals knew of Daniel Stroud, but very few had ever actually met him. He came into Marquette maybe twice a year, always during winter, to trade furs at one of the old trading posts that still operated on the outskirts of town. He'd arrive on an old snowmobile, exchange his pelts for cash or supplies, ammunition, salt, tobacco, and then disappear back into the forest. He didn't talk, didn't make eye contact, didn't engage in conversation beyond the bare minimum necessary to complete a transaction. But he had a reputation. Hunters who'd ventured too close to his territory reported strange experiences, feeling watched, followed. Some said they'd found animal traps that weren't designed to capture animals, They were designed to injure people. Steel leg-hold traps positioned on game trails at ankle height. Bear snares set at head level on paths through dense brush. It was as if someone was trying to keep people out, to defend a perimeter. A few hunters had reported encounters with Stroud himself. They described him as tall, lean, with a long gray beard and eyes that seemed to look through you. They said he'd appear suddenly, silently, watching them from a distance. If they tried to approach or speak to him, he'd vanish back into the forest like a ghost. Some hunters had received warnings, verbal threats delivered in a low, gravelly voice, telling them to leave, to stay away, to never come back. Most people heeded those warnings. The Upper Peninsula was vast. There was plenty of room to hunt elsewhere. No one wanted trouble with the hermit who lived in the deep woods. Investigators decided it was time to pay Daniel Stroud a visit. On December 10th, 2005, a team of Michigan State Police troopers, accompanied by search and rescue personnel and a forensic specialist, made the journey into Stroud's territory. They had obtained the approximate location of his cabin from old property records and from descriptions provided by trappers who'd encountered him over the years. But the cabin wasn't on any map. There were no roads leading to it. The team had to hike in, using GPS coordinates and compass bearings, navigating through dense forest and across frozen streams. It took them over 3 hours to reach the cabin. The structure was crude, built from logs and rough-cut lumber, with a corrugated metal roof and a stone chimney. There were no windows. The door was a single heavy plank of wood, held in place with iron hinges. Smoke was rising from the chimney. Someone was home. The troopers called out, identifying themselves as law enforcement. No response. They called out again, louder this time. Silence. They approached the door carefully, hands on their weapons. One trooper knocked. What? The sound echoed in the frozen forest. Still no response. The door wasn't locked. The trooper pushed it open and stepped inside, flashlight raised. The interior of the cabin was dim, lit only by a wood stove in the corner and whatever daylight filtered through the open door. The space was small, maybe 15 by 20 feet. A cot in one corner. A rough wooden table and chair. Shelves lined with supplies. Canned goods, jars of preserved meat, boxes of ammunition. The walls were covered with maps, hand-drawn and meticulously detailed, showing the surrounding forest, trails, water sources, terrain features. Notations in pencil marked various locations, though their meaning wasn't immediately clear. And hanging from hooks, on one wall, were personal items. A wallet, a wristwatch, a handheld GPS unit, a hunting knife with initials carved into the wooden handle. The forensic specialist stepped forward and examined the items. The GPS unit had a brand name visible on the casing, Garmin. The model was consistent with the one Scott Ramirez's friends said he'd been carrying. The specialist carefully photographed the items without touching them. They searched the cabin more thoroughly. In the corner, hidden under a pile of animal furs, they found more items. Another wallet, another watch, a compass with a cracked face, a pair of hunting gloves, still stiff with dried blood. The items were tagged and collected as evidence. But Daniel Stroud wasn't in the cabin. The troopers searched the area around the structure. They found tracks leading away from the cabin, heading north, deeper into the forest. The tracks were fresh, made within the last few hours. The team followed, moving carefully through the dense pines and over rocky outcroppings. After about a mile, they found him. Daniel Stroud was sitting on a fallen log at the edge of a frozen stream, staring out at the forest as if he were waiting for something. He didn't move when the troopers approached. He didn't resist when they told him to stand up and place his hands behind his back. He said nothing. His face was expressionless, his eyes focused on some distant point beyond the trees. They brought him back to the cabin. They read him his rights. They asked him if he understood. He nodded once, but didn't speak. While Stroud was being taken into custody and transported back to Marquette, the forensic team continued searching the cabin and the surrounding area. Behind the main structure, partially hidden by trees, they found a shed, a smaller building constructed from scrap lumber and corrugated metal. Inside were tools, saws, axes, shovels, skinning knives, the kind of equipment you'd expect a trapper to have. But beneath the shed's dirt floor, investigators found something else. A shallow pit covered with planks of wood. When they removed the planks, they found remains, bones, fragments of clothing, personal effects. Over the next several days, forensic anthropologists carefully excavated the site. They found enough to identify 3 individuals: David Brennan, Scott Ramirez, and Thomas Ellison, all 3 hunters who'd disappeared over Thanksgiving weekend. But they also found more remains. Older remains, scattered bones, fragments of identification cards, and personal items that dated back years. In total, they identified 7 victims, 7 hunters who'd gone missing in the Upper Peninsula over the past decade. Cases that had been written off as accidents. People getting lost in the wilderness, succumbing to exposure. Tragic, but not uncommon in such a harsh environment. But they hadn't been accidents. They'd all been murdered by Daniel Stroud. Under interrogation, back at the Michigan State Police headquarters in Marquette, Stroud eventually began to talk. His voice was low, rough from decades of minimal use. His explanation was chilling in its simplicity. He said the forest was his, that he'd lived there for over 40 years, long before most of the current hunters had ever set foot in the Upper Peninsula. He said he'd built his life there, survived winters that would kill most men, learned to live as part of the wilderness rather than as an intruder in it. But every year, more hunters came. They drove their trucks down the logging roads. They set up camps. They fired their rifles. They left trash. They disrupted the animals. They acted like they owned the place, like the forest was there for their entertainment. He said he'd tried to warn them at first. The traps, the signs, the silent appearances meant to frighten them away. But they kept coming, especially during Thanksgiving weekend. The woods would be full of them. Dozens of men, sometimes more, trampling through his territory, taking what wasn't theirs, destroying the peace he'd worked so hard to build. So he started eliminating them. He described his method in detached, clinical terms, as if discussing a routine maintenance task. He would watch the hunters from a distance, learn their patterns, identify the ones who ventured farthest from the main roads, the ones who set up camps in the most remote locations, the ones who hunted alone. Then he'd wait until they were vulnerable, setting up a tent, checking a trail, field dressing a deer. He'd approach from downwind, using the terrain and his intimate knowledge of the forest to stay hidden. He was an expert tracker. He knew how to move silently, how to use shadows and cover, how to get close without being detected. He'd been doing it for decades. Sometimes he'd use a trap, a concealed snare, a leg-hold device positioned on a trail he knew they'd take. Other times, he'd simply wait until they were distracted and strike from behind with a blunt object, a rock, a heavy branch, the back of an axe. Once they were incapacitated, he'd finish the job. Quickly, efficiently. Then he'd take anything useful. Watches, knives, GPS units, tools. And he'd bury the bodies in places where they'd never be found. Ravines, beneath rock overhangs, in the soft earth beneath his shed. He'd been doing it for years. David, Scott, and Thomas weren't his first victims. They were just the first ones whose disappearances had occurred close enough together, in a short enough time frame, that authorities realized something was wrong. Daniel Stroud was charged with 7 counts of first-degree murder. At trial, held in early 2007, the prosecution presented the overwhelming physical evidence: the personal items found in his cabin, the remains found beneath his shed, the maps showing his territory and the locations where victims had last been seen. They presented his confession, recorded and transcribed. They presented testimony from forensic anthropologists, tracking experts, and criminal psychologists who explained how Stroud had systematically hunted and killed 7 men over the course of a decade. They carry satellite phones and GPS beacons. They tell people exactly where they'll be and when they'll return. The wilderness is still beautiful, still wild, still one of the last truly remote places left in the eastern United States. But it's no longer seen as entirely safe. Because the case proves something that most people prefer not to think about. That in the deepest parts of the forest, far from roads and towns and the rule of law, danger doesn't always come from the environment. Sometimes it comes from the person who's been there longer than anyone else. The person who's decided that the wilderness belongs to them, and them alone. He rarely speaks to anyone, inmates, guards, or administrators. He's never expressed remorse. In the few interviews he's granted to criminal psychologists over the years, he's maintained that he was defending his home, his territory, his way of life. The families of the 7 victims were devastated. For years, they believed their loved ones had died in accidents. Tragic, but explicable. The idea that they'd been hunted, stalked, and murdered by a man who viewed them as nothing more than intruders was almost unbearable. The Upper Peninsula is still a popular hunting destination. Thousands of hunters make the trip north every fall, drawn by the promise of wilderness, solitude, and abundant game. But the case of Daniel Stroud changed how people approach it. Hunters are more cautious now. They stay in groups. They avoid the most remote areas. They carry satellite phones and GPS beacons. They tell people exactly where they'll be and when they'll return. The wilderness is still beautiful, still wild, still one of the last truly remote places left in the eastern United States. But it's no longer seen as entirely safe. Because the case proves something that most people prefer not to think about. That in the deepest parts of the forest, far from roads and towns and the rule of law, danger doesn't always come from the environment. Sometimes it comes from the person who's been there longer than anyone else. The person who's decided that the wilderness belongs to them, and them alone. The Black Friday Betrayal. The Secret of the Factory Town. The day after Thanksgiving, 1999. Black Friday, a term that had, by the late 1990s, become synonymous with shopping, with deals, with a chaotic rush of consumers flooding stores in search of bargains. But in a small, unnamed factory town about 15 miles outside Altoona, Pennsylvania, Black Friday took on a different meaning, a darker meaning. The town doesn't appear on most maps. It's one of those places that exists in the gaps, listed sometimes as an unincorporated community, sometimes as part of a larger township, sometimes not listed at all. Locals just call it the Mill Town or the Factory District. Population maybe 3,000 on a good day, though by 1999, that number had been declining steadily for years. The town had been built around a single economic engine, a large textile mill that had operated since the early 1900s. For decades, the mill had been the lifeblood of the community. It employed over 800 people at its peak in the 1960s and 70s. Entire families worked there. Fathers, sons, daughters, grandparents. The mill wasn't just a job. It was an identity. It was what held the community together. But in 1997, the mill closed. The company that owned it had been bought out by a larger corporation. Operations were moved overseas where labor was cheaper. The building was shut down, the equipment sold off, the workers laid off with minimal severance. Almost overnight, the town's economy collapsed. By 1999, the effects were visible everywhere. Storefronts on Main Street were boarded up. Houses sat empty, foreclosure signs in the yards. The downtown, a single street with a handful of shops, was now a ghost town. The younger generation had left for cities, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, anywhere with jobs. The people who remained were the ones who couldn't leave or didn't want to. Older folks who'd worked at the mill for 40 years and had nowhere else to go. Families with roots so deep in the community that pulling them up felt impossible. People who'd rather struggle in a familiar place than start over somewhere new. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where gossip traveled faster than news, where people looked out for each other, but also watched each other, keeping track of who was doing what, who was struggling, who was getting ahead, who was stepping out of line. It was insular, tight-knit, cautious, and deeply suspicious of outsiders. Maria Alvarez was 23 years old. She'd been born and raised in the town. She'd graduated from the local high school, a building that was now half empty, with only a fraction of the students it had served a decade earlier. She'd stayed after graduation because leaving meant abandoning her family. Her mother, Rosa, was sick. Diabetes had led to complications, neuropathy, vision problems, kidney issues. She needed regular medical care, help with daily tasks. Maria's father, Carlos, had worked at the mill for 32 years before it closed. He was in his late 50s now, too old to easily find new work, doing odd jobs around town to make ends meet. Repairs, landscaping, whatever people needed. Maria was the oldest of 4 siblings. 2 younger brothers still in high school. A younger sister in middle school. Maria worked to help support the family. On Black Friday, 1999, Maria was working as a cashier at a factory outlet store on the edge of town. The store was part of a small chain that sold discounted clothing and household goods, overstock items, slightly damaged merchandise, things that hadn't sold at full price elsewhere. It wasn't glamorous work. The pay was minimum wage. The hours were long, and the customers could be difficult. But it was one of the few jobs available in the area, and it paid better than most, especially during the holiday season when the store was busy. Black Friday was the busiest day of the year. The store opened at 5 a.m., and by the time the doors unlocked, there was already a line of customers stretching across the parking lot. People looking for deals on winter coats, toys for their kids, kitchen appliances. The chaos was intense. Customers fought over discounted items. Lines at the registers stretched to the back of the store. Cashiers worked non-stop, scanning items, bagging purchases, dealing with complaints and returns. Maria had worked the opening shift, starting at 5 a.m. By 10 p.m., when her shift finally ended, she was exhausted. Her feet ached. Her voice was hoarse from answering the same questions hundreds of times. She clocked out, grabbed her coat from the employee break room, and walked out to the parking lot behind the store where employees parked. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. On the morning of November 26th, Maria's mother called the outlet store. Maria hadn't come home the night before. Her bed hadn't been slept in. Her car was gone. She wasn't answering her phone. Rosa was worried. Maria was responsible. She always called if she was going to be late. She always let her family know where she was. The store manager, a woman named Janet Pritchard, checked the employee time log. Maria had clocked out at 10:03 p.m. As far as Janet knew, Maria had left. The manager tried calling Maria's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. Maria's father, Carlos, drove to the outlet store. Her car wasn't in the parking lot. He drove the route Maria would have taken home, checking side streets, looking for any sign of her car. Nothing. He called the local police department. The police force in the mill town was small, a chief and 4 officers. They took the missing person report and began making inquiries. They checked Maria's usual route home. They called her friends. They checked the local hospital. Nothing. Nothing. On November 27th, 2 days after Maria disappeared, her car was found. A resident walking his dog noticed a vehicle parked on a narrow side street about 3 blocks from Maria's house. The car had been there for over a day, which was unusual. The resident called the police. Officers ran the license plate. It was Maria's car. The doors were locked. Officers looked through the windows. Maria's purse was on the passenger seat. Her phone was there too. There were no signs of a struggle inside the vehicle. No broken glass. No blood. It looked like Maria had simply parked the car and walked away. But Maria's house was 3 blocks away. Why would she park here and walk? Why wouldn't she drive all the way home? On November 28th, Maria's body was found. A neighbor, an elderly man named Frank Delgado, was taking out his trash when he noticed a smell coming from the vacant house next door. The house had been empty for months, ever since the previous owners had lost it to foreclosure and moved out after the mill closed. The property was in bad shape: peeling paint, overgrown yard, broken windows. No one had lived there since early 1999. Frank called the police. 2 officers responded. They approached the vacant house cautiously. The front door was unlocked. They entered, flashlights raised. The smell was overwhelming. They followed it to the basement. At the bottom of the stairs, they found Maria. She'd been strangled. Her body was positioned on the concrete floor, arms at her sides, legs straight. She'd been dead for at least 2 days, possibly longer. The medical examiner later estimated the time of death at late on November 25th, sometime between 10 p.m. and midnight, shortly after Maria had clocked out of work. But investigators immediately noticed something disturbing. There were no signs of forced entry into the vacant house. The front door had been unlocked. The windows, though broken in places, showed no evidence of recent disturbance. Someone had been inside this house, and they'd been there before the night Maria was killed. Detectives searched the house thoroughly. In the main room, they found evidence that someone had been living there, temporarily. A sleeping bag, rolled up in a corner. Food wrappers, fast food, granola bars. A flashlight with dead batteries. Cigarette butts. Someone had been using the vacant house as a hideout. A place to watch, to wait, to plan. Detectives began interviewing people in the neighborhood. This was where the investigation hit a wall. This was a factory town, insular, suspicious of outsiders, and even more suspicious of authority, especially police from outside the immediate community. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. Neighbors who lived on the same street as the vacant house, people whose windows looked directly at the property, claimed they hadn't noticed anyone coming or going, even though the house had clearly been occupied. One neighbor, when pressed, admitted she'd seen someone near the vacant house a few times over the past couple of weeks. A man. But she couldn't describe him. Didn't want to get involved. Didn't want to cause trouble. Detectives realized they were dealing with something more than just a lack of witnesses. People were actively refusing to talk, whether out of fear, loyalty to someone in the community, or a deep-seated distrust of law enforcement. The town was closing ranks. The wall of silence was impenetrable. The Pennsylvania State Police were called in. They expanded the investigation, bringing in additional resources. They started looking into Maria's life, her relationships, her work, anything that might provide a lead. They began interviewing Maria's co-workers at the outlet store, and that's when a pattern started to emerge. Several of Maria's female co-workers mentioned, cautiously at first and then with more detail, that they'd felt uncomfortable around one of the store managers. Not Janet Pritchard, the day shift manager who'd reported Maria missing. The other manager, the one who worked evenings and handled closing shifts. His name was Walter Jenkins. Walter Jenkins was 47 years old. He'd been working at the outlet store since it opened in 1995. He'd started as a floor supervisor and had been promoted to evening manager within a year. He was known for being strict, controlling. He micromanaged his staff, watched them constantly, criticized minor mistakes. He had a reputation for being difficult to work with. But there was something else, something darker. Multiple female employees, when interviewed separately, described behavior that made them uncomfortable. Walter Jenkins would stare at them, watch them for long periods without speaking. He'd make comments about their appearance, what they were wearing, how they looked, whether they'd changed their hair. He'd find reasons to be near them, to brush past them in narrow aisles, to stand too close during conversations. Maria had mentioned it to a friend a few weeks before her death. She'd said Jenkins made her uncomfortable, that he'd started scheduling her for more closing shifts, times when fewer people were in the store, when it was just her and one or two other employees and Jenkins. She'd said he'd asked her personal questions, where she lived, whether she had a boyfriend, what she did after work. She'd said he'd offered to drive her home once after a late shift, and she'd refused. She'd started asking coworkers to walk with her to her car at the end of the night. But then something unexpected surfaced. Detectives brought Walter Jenkins in for questioning on December 1st. He came voluntarily. He seemed cooperative, calm. He said he was shocked by Maria's death. He said she'd been a good employee, reliable, hardworking. He said he'd noticed she seemed tired on Black Friday, that it had been a long, difficult shift for everyone, but otherwise she'd seemed fine. "Where were you on the night of November 25th, after the store closed?" Jenkins said he'd been at the store until around 11 p.m., finishing the closing procedures, counting the registers, securing the cash, locking the doors. Then he'd gone home. He lived alone in a small house about 2 miles from the store. No one could verify his whereabouts after 11 p.m. Detectives asked if he'd consent to a search of his home and vehicle. Jenkins hesitated. His demeanor changed. The calm facade cracked slightly. He said he wanted to talk to a lawyer first. That was enough to get a warrant. On December 3rd, investigators executed search warrants on Walter Jenkins' home and his vehicle, a dark blue Ford Taurus sedan. Inside the vehicle, forensic technicians found fibers. Synthetic fibers that matched the fabric of the clothing Maria had been wearing on November 25th, a black sweater and jeans. The fibers were found on the passenger seat and in the trunk. They also found something else. Hidden under the driver's seat, wrapped in a towel, was a small handheld video camera. A camcorder, the kind that had been popular in the 1990s, before everyone had cameras on their phones. The camera contained a tape. When investigators played it back, they found hours of footage of Maria. The footage showed Maria at work, walking through the store, standing at her register, talking to customers, taking her break in the employee room, walking to her car in the parking lot at the end of her shift. The footage was taken from a distance, filmed surreptitiously, without Maria's knowledge. It was obsessive, invasive, disturbing. The final segment of video on the tape was from November 25th. It showed Maria leaving the store at the end of her Black Friday shift, walking across the parking lot to her car. And then the camera moved. The perspective shifted. Whoever was filming was following her. The footage showed Jenkins, his reflection briefly visible in a car window, approaching Maria as she reached her vehicle. The video cut off, but investigators knew what had happened next. In Walter Jenkins' home, they found more evidence. In a desk drawer in his bedroom, they found a notebook, a journal, pages and pages of handwritten entries, dating back months. The entries detailed Jenkins' obsession with Maria. He'd written about watching her at work, about how he believed she was special, about how he thought she was meant for him. He'd written about his frustration that she didn't seem to notice him, didn't respond to his attempts at conversation, didn't accept his offers of help. The entries grew darker as they progressed. He wrote about following her home after work, learning her route, identifying where she lived. He wrote about the vacant house near her home, how he'd noticed it was empty, how he'd broken in and set it up as a place to watch from, a place to wait. He wrote about planning, about how he would approach her, about how he would convince her to talk to him, to understand his feelings. He wrote about Black Friday, about how the chaos of the day would provide an opportunity, a moment when no one was paying attention, when he could act. The final entries, written in the days before Thanksgiving, described his plan in detail. He would wait for Maria in the parking lot. He would approach her as she left, tell her there was a problem with her time card or her paycheck, something that required her to come back inside or to follow him. If she refused, he'd find another way. He'd convince her. He'd make her understand. But Maria hadn't understood. She'd resisted, and Jenkins had killed her. Walter Jenkins was arrested on December 4th, 1999. He was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and stalking. At trial, held in the summer of 2000, the prosecution presented the video footage, the journal, the forensic evidence from Jenkins' car, and testimony from Maria's co-workers describing his inappropriate behavior. On September 12, 2000, Walter Jenkins was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He's currently incarcerated at CI Rockview in Center County, Pennsylvania. The factory town was shaken. People had known something was wrong. Maria had felt unsafe. Coworkers had noticed Jenkins' behavior, but no one had intervened. The insularity of the town had created an environment where a predator could operate unchecked. Maria's family still lives in the town. Every Black Friday, they place flowers where her body was found, a reminder that silence can enable monsters. The Turkey Day Terror, the behavioral anomalies of the holiday harvester. Between 1993 and 1995, the suburban communities surrounding Omaha, Nebraska, were gripped by an escalating pattern of terror. A serial stalker, later dubbed by local media as the Holiday Harvester, systematically targeted elderly residents in the weeks leading up to and including Thanksgiving. The pattern was chilling, methodical, ritualistic, and unlike anything law enforcement in the region had encountered before. The first incident occurred on November 20th, 1993, a Saturday, the weekend before Thanksgiving. Dorothy Keene was 76 years old. She lived alone in a modest ranch-style house in Papillion, a suburb just south of Omaha. She'd been a school teacher for over 40 years, teaching elementary school in the Papillion Ala Vista School District until her retirement in 1986. She was known in her neighborhood as kind, independent, still sharp despite her age. She attended Mass every Sunday at St. Columkill Catholic Church. She volunteered at church bake sales. She kept her lawn neat, her house tidy. She was the kind of neighbor people looked up to. On the morning of November 20th, Dorothy woke up and noticed something wrong. The exterior holiday lights she'd put up the previous weekend, simple strands of white lights along her porch railing and around her front door, weren't working. She went outside to check. The lights had been cut, not unplugged, not removed. Cut, dirty. The wires had been severed cleanly, deliberately, in multiple places. Dorothy was confused. Who would do this? Why? She went back inside and called the Papillion Police Department. 2 officers responded. They examined the lights. The cuts were clean, made with a sharp tool, wire cutters or scissors. But there was no other damage to the property. No graffiti, no broken windows, no signs of vandalism beyond the lights. The officers walked around the house, checking doors and windows. That's when they found evidence of entry. A basement window had been pried open. The lock was broken. Someone had entered Dorothy's house during the night. Dorothy hadn't heard anything. She'd been asleep upstairs. She hadn't noticed anyone inside. But the evidence was clear. Someone had broken in. The officers searched the house with Dorothy. They checked every room. Nothing appeared to be missing. Dorothy's jewelry was untouched. Her television, her electronics, all still there. Money she kept in a drawer in her bedroom was still there. Whoever had entered hadn't taken anything. But then Dorothy found the note. It was on her kitchen table, placed carefully in the center. A single sheet of white notebook paper, folded in half. Dorothy opened it. Inside, in neat handwriting, was a message. The lights are a lie. Harvest comes in darkness. You will understand. Dorothy's hands trembled as she showed the note to the officers. They bagged it as evidence. They dusted the house for fingerprints. They found none. They asked Dorothy if she recognized the handwriting. She didn't. They asked if she had any enemies, anyone who might want to frighten her. She couldn't think of anyone. The incident was filed as a burglary. Disturbing certainly, but not violent. The officers recommended Dorothy install new locks. They increased patrols in her neighborhood. But without more evidence, there was little else they could do. 2 weeks later, on December 4th, 1993, another incident occurred. Harold Simmons was 81 years old. He lived alone in a small house in Bellevue, a suburb to the east of Omaha. He was a widower. His wife had passed away 3 years earlier. He was a veteran, having served in World War II. He was active in his local VFW post. He still drove, still mowed his own lawn, still lived independently. On the morning of December 4th, Harold noticed his exterior Christmas lights weren't working. He'd put them up the week before, colored bulbs along the eaves of his house, a lit wreath on the front door. He went outside to check. The lights had been cut. The wires were severed in multiple places. Harold was annoyed but not alarmed. He figured it was kids. Vandalism. He called the Bellevue Police Department to report it. Officers responded. While examining the lights, they noticed a basement window was open. They asked Harold if he'd left it open. He said no. The officers checked the window. The lock had been forced. Someone had been inside Harold's house. The officers searched the house with Harold. Nothing appeared to be missing. But on the kitchen table, they found a note, folded neatly, handwritten. The message was eerily similar to the one left at Dorothy Keene's house. Harvest the peace before the chaos. The lights blind you to truth. The Bellevue police contacted the Papillion police. The handwriting was compared. It was identical. Same neat script. Same type of paper. Same inexplicable message. Law enforcement across the Omaha metro area realized they had a problem. A serial stalker. Someone targeting elderly individuals. Someone with a fixation on holiday lights. Someone who wasn't stealing, wasn't vandalizing. Just breaking in, disabling lights, and leaving cryptic, rambling notes. But what was the motive? What did harvest mean? Why target the elderly? Why the obsession with lights? Over the next 2 years, between November 1993 and November 1995, law enforcement documented 12 separate incidents following the same pattern. Victims were elderly, living alone. All incidents occurred in suburban communities around Omaha. Papillion, Bellevue, La Vista, Ralston, Terrell. All break-ins occurred at night, between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. Exterior holiday lights were always disabled, cut, smashed, or removed. Handwritten notes were left inside the homes, always on the kitchen table. Nothing was stolen. The notes contained rambling messages about harvesting, darkness, peace, truth, and the lies represented by holiday lights. But then, in November 1995, the pattern changed. The stalker escalated to violence. On the night of November 22, 1995, the night before Thanksgiving, an elderly woman named Margaret Foster, 73, was attacked in her home in La Vista. Margaret had gone to bed around 10 p.m. She was awakened around 2 a.m. by the sound of breaking glass downstairs. She got out of bed and tried to call 911. The phone line was dead. Cut. She heard footsteps on the stairs. Someone was coming up to the second floor. Margaret, terrified, tried to barricade herself in her bedroom, but the door was pushed open. A figure entered. A man, dressed in dark clothing, wearing gloves, his face partially obscured by a hood. Margaret screamed. The man rushed forward and struck her with a blunt object, later determined to be a heavy flashlight. Margaret fell. The man struck her again, and again. Margaret lost consciousness. When she came to, it was morning. She was lying on the floor of her bedroom, blood pooling around her head. She managed to crawl to a neighbor's house and pound on the door. The neighbor called 911. Margaret was rushed to the hospital. She'd suffered a severe concussion, multiple facial fractures, and lacerations that required over 50 stitches. But she survived. When she was able to speak, she described her attacker to police. White male. Average height maybe 5'10" or 5'11". Average build. She couldn't see his face clearly, but she remembered his voice. He'd been muttering to himself during the attack. She couldn't make out all the words, but she heard fragments. The harvest. Cleansing the light. Darkness brings truth. Police searched Margaret's home. Her exterior holiday lights had been cut, and on the kitchen table, they found a note. The harvest must be completed. The lights deceive. Peace comes only in darkness. Law enforcement knew they had to act. The stalker had escalated from psychological terror to physical violence. It was only a matter of time before someone was killed. A multi-agency task force was formed, including investigators from the Omaha Police Department, the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, the Sarpy County Sheriff's Office, and the Nebraska State Patrol. They brought in behavioral analysts from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit in Quantico. The FBI analysts reviewed all the evidence, the notes, the crime scenes, the victim profiles. They developed a psychological profile. White male, likely between 30 and 50 years old. Highly organized, methodical, patient. Obsessive-compulsive tendencies evident in the neat handwriting and ritualistic behavior. Likely employed in a profession that gave him access to victims' neighborhoods without arousing suspicion. Possible background in agriculture, farming, or a field involving seasonal cycles. Deep-seated psychological disturbance likely rooted in religious fanaticism or moral absolutism. The fixation on harvesting and seasonal cycles suggested someone who viewed the world through an agricultural lens. One detail stood out to investigators: the repeated use of agricultural metaphors. Harvest, reaping, planting, truth. These weren't common phrases in everyday speech. They suggested someone with a background in farming or agricultural science. Detectives began compiling lists of individuals in the Omaha area who fit the profile. They looked at teachers, particularly those who taught science or agriculture. They looked at farm workers. They looked at employees of agricultural extension offices. They cross-referenced names with individuals who lived or worked in the suburbs where the incidents had occurred. One name surfaced repeatedly: Victor Hammond. Victor Hammond was 41 years old in 1995. He'd been teaching high school science at Papillion La Vista South High School for over 15 years. He taught biology, chemistry, and environmental science. He was known as a competent teacher, though some students found him intense and difficult to relate to. He didn't socialize much with other faculty. He kept to himself. Hammond also worked part-time on weekends at a family-owned farm on the outskirts of Papillion. He helped with equipment maintenance, seasonal planting and harvesting, general labor. He'd grown up on a farm in rural Nebraska, studied agricultural science at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln before switching his major to education. He was deeply religious. He attended a small fundamentalist church in a rural area south of Omaha, a congregation that followed a strict, literalist interpretation of the Bible. The church was known for its extreme views on modern culture, which it viewed as corrupt and sinful. Hammond had never been married. He lived alone in a modest house in Papillion, just a few miles from where Dorothy Keene, the first victim, lived. Detectives began surveillance on Victor Hammond. They watched his movements. They noted that he often drove through the neighborhoods where the victims lived, sometimes late at night. They observed him attending his church, working at the farm, teaching at the school. On December 8, 1995, investigators obtained a search warrant for Hammond's home. They executed it early in the morning, before Hammond left for school. Inside, they found the typewriter, an old manual Underwood typewriter sitting on a desk in Hammond's small home office. Forensic analysis would later confirm that every note left at the victims' homes had been typed on that machine. The unique characteristics of the typeface, the spacing, the alignment, all matched perfectly. They also found a calendar hanging on the wall. It was marked extensively in red ink. Each mark corresponded to one of the 12 break-ins. Next to each date were initials, the initials of the victims. And beside some of the entries were notations: lights removed, message delivered, harvest progressing. In a filing cabinet drawer, investigators found essays. Pages and pages of handwritten and typed essays composed by Hammond over the course of several years. The essays detailed his philosophy, his worldview, his beliefs about modern society. He wrote about how Christmas had become a pagan celebration of consumerism, how Thanksgiving had been perverted into an excuse for gluttony and materialism, how holiday lights represented false idols, superficial joy, and spiritual corruption. He wrote about how modern Americans had lost touch with the true meaning of the holidays, how they celebrated without understanding, how they participated in rituals that had become empty and meaningless. He wrote extensively about harvesting. He used agricultural metaphors to describe his mission. He wrote about reaping the corrupted, cleansing the fields, removing the weeds of falsehood. He wrote about elderly people specifically, describing them as the most infected by false traditions because they'd participated in these corrupted celebrations for decades, passing down empty rituals to younger generations without questioning their spiritual bankruptcy. Victor Hammond was arrested on December 10, 1995. He was charged with 12 counts of burglary, 1 count of attempted murder, and multiple counts of stalking and terroristic threatening. Under interrogation, Hammond was calm, almost serene. He didn't deny what he'd done. He described his actions as necessary, righteous. He said the holiday lights were an affront to God, that Thanksgiving and Christmas had been corrupted beyond recognition, that someone needed to speak the truth, even if others weren't ready to hear it. Hammond was convicted on all counts in October 1996. He was sentenced to 45 years in prison. He's currently incarcerated at the Nebraska State Penitentiary in Lincoln. The communities around Omaha slowly recovered, But for years, elderly residents were afraid to put up holiday lights. The Thanksgiving season had been tainted. This case remains one of the most disturbing examples of how psychological fixation escalates to violence. Victor Hammond started with extreme beliefs. When people didn't validate those beliefs, he turned to terror. The empty seats at Thanksgiving tables weren't filled with the dead, but with the traumatized. And that was exactly the harvest Victor Hammond intended. The family photo frame, the devastating secret of the Dallas suburbs. Thanksgiving Day, 2011. A quiet suburb in the northern outskirts of Dallas, Texas. The kind of neighborhood where lawns are manicured, where houses sit behind brick facades with two-car garages, where children play in cul-de-sacs and parents gather for block parties in the summer. This was a community that represented the American dream. Middle to upper middle class families, stable jobs, good schools, safe streets. The kind of place where people move to raise their children, to build lives, to feel secure. The Thornton family lived in a two-story brick house on Maple Ridge Drive. James Thornton was 42 years old. He worked in commercial real estate, managing properties for a regional firm. His wife, Laura, was 39. She'd been a school counselor before taking time off to raise their children full-time. They had two kids, Emma, 13, and Michael, 10. By all outward appearances, the Thorntons were a successful, happy family. They attended church. They were involved in their kids' schools. Neighbors described them as friendly, engaged, normal. On Thanksgiving morning, the Thorntons were supposed to host dinner. Laura's parents were driving in from Houston. James's brother and his family were coming from Fort Worth. It was going to be a full house. 3 generations, cousins, the whole extended family gathered for the holiday. But around 11 a.m., when Laura's parents arrived at the Thornton house, something was wrong. The front door was locked. No one answered when they knocked. Cars were in the driveway, both James's SUV and Laura's sedan. The house lights were on, but there was no movement inside. No sounds. No response. Laura's father, David Mercer, called Laura's cell phone. It rang inside the house, but no one answered. He called James's phone. Same thing. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. David walked around to the back of the house. The back door was also locked. He looked through the windows. The kitchen was neat. The dining room table was set for Thanksgiving dinner. Plates, silverware, a centerpiece. Everything was ready. But where was the family? David called 911. Officers from the local police department arrived within 10 minutes. They knocked on the front door, identified themselves, and announced they were entering the home for a welfare check. They tried the door. Locked. Mutants. An officer went around to the back. Also locked. They made the decision to force entry. An officer broke a small window near the back door, reached through, and unlocked it from the inside. The officers entered the house, weapons drawn, calling out. No response. They moved through the first floor. The kitchen was clean. The dining room was set. The living room was tidy. Everything looked normal, peaceful, ready for a holiday celebration. But as they approached the stairs leading to the second floor, they noticed something. A smell. Faint, but unmistakable. Metallic. Dawn. Sharp. Darosh. Blood. They climbed the stairs. The smell grew stronger. At the top of the stairs, the hallway branched left and right. The master bedroom was to the left. The children's rooms to the right. The officers turned right first. They opened the door to Emma's room. Emma Thornton was on her bed. She'd been shot. Once. In the head. The pillow beneath her was soaked with blood. Her eyes were closed. She looked like she might have been sleeping when it happened. The officers moved to the next room. Michael's room. Same scene. Michael was in his bed. Shot. Dull. Once. In the head. The blanket pulled up to his chest. His stuffed bear tucked beside him. The officers moved quickly to the master bedroom. They found Laura Thornton on the floor near the bed. She'd been shot multiple times. Twice in the chest. Once in the head. Blood had pooled on the carpet. Her body was positioned as if she'd tried to run, tried to escape, but hadn't made it far. And in the bathroom attached to the master bedroom, they found James Thornton. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the bathtub. A handgun, a .45 caliber pistol, was on the floor beside him. He'd been shot once, in the head, self-inflicted. The gun was registered to him. 4 bodies, an entire family, dead. The initial scene appeared to be a home invasion, a robbery, the kind of random, horrific violence that occasionally strikes even the safest neighborhoods. But as investigators processed the scene, inconsistencies emerged. There was no sign of forced entry, aside from the window the officer had broken to get inside. All doors and windows were locked from the inside. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. Laura's jewelry was untouched. Electronics, televisions, computers were all still in place. Wallets with cash and credit cards sat on the dresser in the master bedroom. And the way the family had been killed suggested something else. The children had been shot in their beds. They'd likely been asleep or had just woken up. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle. Laura had been killed near the bedroom door, as if she tried to flee. And James had died last, in the bathroom, from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Detectives began to consider an alternative scenario. Murder-suicide. James Thornton had killed his family and then himself. But why? What could have driven a seemingly normal, stable man to commit such an unthinkable act? Investigators began digging into James Thornton's life. They interviewed co-workers, friends, family members. They examined financial records. They searched the house for evidence, notes, letters, anything that might explain what had happened. What they found was devastating. James Thornton's financial situation was catastrophic, and he'd been hiding it from everyone, including his wife. In 2008, during the financial crisis, James had made several risky investments. He borrowed heavily against the equity in his home to invest in commercial real estate ventures that he believed would pay off. But the market had collapsed. The investments had failed, and James had lost everything. By 2011, James was drowning in debt. He owed over $300,000 to private lenders. The house was in foreclosure. The bank had filed papers to repossess it in early November. Credit card companies were pursuing him for unpaid balances, totaling over $80,000. And his employer had placed him on probation after discovering discrepancies in client accounts that suggested James had been mismanaging funds, possibly embezzling, to cover his personal debts. James was facing financial ruin, professional disgrace, potential criminal charges, and he hadn't told Laura any of it. He'd hidden the foreclosure notices. He'd intercepted collection calls. He'd lied about their finances for years, maintaining the appearance of stability while everything collapsed around him. Laura had no idea. The children had no idea. To them, everything was normal. Dad was still going to work. Mom was still planning Thanksgiving dinner. Life was fine. But for James, the walls were closing in, and he couldn't see a way out. Investigators found evidence that James had been planning the murder-suicide for at least a week. In his office at home, hidden in a desk drawer, they found a calendar. On Thanksgiving Day, circled in red, James had written, "The end. No more lies. No more shame." They also found drafts of a suicide note. Multiple versions, written and rewritten, as if James had been trying to find the right words to explain the inexplicable. The drafts were filled with apologies, justifications, rambling explanations about financial pressure, about not being able to face his family's disappointment, about believing it would be better for everyone if they all left together. But James had never finished the note. He'd never settled on a final version. Instead, he'd written a different message. And this was the detail that shattered whatever remained of the community's sense of comprehension. Inside, a Thanksgiving card. A card Laura had purchased weeks earlier. One of those generic holiday cards with a picture of autumn leaves and a message about gratitude. James had written his final message. The card was addressed to his brother, Mark Doughty. It was found in the master bedroom, placed on the dresser where it would be easily discovered. The message inside was brief. "Mark, I'm sorry. I couldn't face what I'd done. I couldn't let them see me fail. I thought if we all went together, no one would have to suffer the shame. I thought it would be easier. I was wrong. Tell them I'm sorry. Tell them I love them. But I was too weak. James. The forensic timeline reconstructed what had happened on Thanksgiving morning. James had woken up early, around 5 a.m. He'd gone to his office and retrieved the handgun he kept in a locked drawer. He'd loaded it. Then he'd gone to Emma's room first. She'd been asleep. He'd shot her. Once. Quick. She likely never woke up. Then Michael's room. Same method. Michael had been asleep. One shot. Instantaneous. Then James had returned to the master bedroom. Laura had woken up by then. She'd heard the shots. She'd realized what was happening. She'd tried to run, tried to get out of the room, possibly to check on the children or to escape. But James had shot her multiple times until she stopped moving. And then James had gone into the bathroom. He'd sat down on the floor, his back against the tub, and he'd turned the gun on himself. The estimated time of death for all 4 family members was between 5:30 a.m. and 6 a.m. on Thanksgiving morning. By the time Laura's parents arrived at 11 a.m., the family had been dead for over 5 hours. James Thornton had killed his entire family, his wife, his children, the people he claimed to love more than anything, and then taken his own life because he couldn't face the shame of financial failure, because he believed that death was preferable to admitting the truth. The community was devastated. Neighbors who'd lived on the same street as the Thorntons for years struggled to comprehend what had happened. How could someone who seemed so normal, so stable, so engaged, commit such an act? The answer, investigators explained, was pressure. Hidden pressure. James Thornton had been living a double life. On the surface, everything looked fine. But beneath that surface, he was collapsing. And rather than ask for help, rather than admit failure, rather than face the consequences of his financial decisions, he'd chosen to destroy everything. The psychological profile developed by forensic specialists described James as someone with extreme control issues, an inability to tolerate personal failure, and a distorted sense of responsibility. He believed that his family's well-being depended entirely on his ability to provide financial stability. When that stability collapsed, he couldn't separate his identity from his failure. He couldn't imagine a future where his family knew the truth. And in his distorted thinking, he convinced himself that killing them and himself was an act of protection, a way to spare them the suffering he believed would come from his failure. It was a delusion, a tragic, catastrophic delusion. The funerals were held on December 3, 2011. Over 800 people attended. The church was filled beyond capacity. Laura's parents, James's brother, extended family, friends, neighbors, all gathered to mourn a family that had been destroyed not by external violence, but by internal collapse. At the service, Laura's father, David Mercer, spoke. He talked about his daughter, about his grandchildren, about the lives they should have lived, and he talked about James, not with hatred, though he would have been justified in feeling it, but with profound sadness and confusion. He said, "We'll never fully understand what happened in James's mind. We'll never know why he believed this was the only way. But I want everyone here to understand something. If you're struggling, financially, emotionally, in any way, please ask for help. Please talk to someone. Please, don't hide your pain until it becomes unbearable. Because this," he gestured to the 4 caskets at the front of the church, "this didn't have to happen." The Thornton house was eventually sold in 2013. The new owners tore it down and built a different structure on the lot. They wanted no connection to what had happened there, but the memory remains, in the community, in the minds of everyone who knew the Thorntons or lived near them. Every Thanksgiving, people remember. They remember the family that should have been gathered around a table, celebrating, sharing a meal. Instead, they were killed before the sun rose. Victims not of an intruder or a stranger, but of the person who was supposed to protect them. This case remains one of the most emotionally devastating in recent Texas history, not because of the method, not because of the violence, but because of the betrayal. Because James Thornton, faced with his own failures and unable to confront them, made the decision to take everyone he loved with him into the darkness. The question that haunts investigators, family members, and the community is this: was James Thornton's crime a betrayal of the holiday spirit? Or was it a deep-seated cry for help that went unheard until it was too late? There's no easy answer. James left no coherent explanation. His note was fragmented, filled with apologies but lacking true insight into his mental state. Psychologists who've studied the case suggest he was experiencing a profound dissociative break, a psychological collapse where his sense of reality became so distorted that murder-suicide seemed like a rational solution. But rational, it was not. It was tragedy. Pure, senseless tragedy. The empty seats at Thanksgiving tables across that Dallas suburb aren't just for the Thorntons. They're for every family that's been touched by the knowledge that safety is an illusion. That the person sitting across from you at dinner might be hiding pain you can't see. That the holiday season, meant to bring families together, can sometimes be the backdrop for their destruction. What do you think? Was James Thornton's crime a betrayal of everything the holiday represents? Or was it the final, desperate act of a man whose mind had shattered under pressure he felt he couldn't share? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you or someone you know is struggling with finances, with mental health, with anything, please reach out. Talk to someone. Ask for help. Because the alternative, as the Thornton case so horrifically demonstrates, is a loss that no one should have to endure. This is Plain Sight Docs. These are the stories we tell not to sensationalize tragedy, but to understand it, to learn from it, and to remind ourselves that the monsters aren't always strangers in the dark. Sometimes, they're the people we live with, the people we trust, the people we love. Subscribe for more investigations into the cases that haunt small-town America. And remember, the truth is always hidden in plain sight.